There are certain rules you learn when you work for a man like Seok-jin. You don't ask where he's been. You don't comment on the calls that come in after midnight, the ones where he steps out of the room without a word and comes back 3 minutes later like nothing happened. You don't look too long at the men who stand by the door, the ones with earpieces and blank expressions, the ones who never eat, never laugh, never seem to breathe at the wrong moment. You learn very quickly that the job is not just about scheduling his meetings or managing his calendar or making sure his 11 a.m. coffee is exactly the right temperature. The job is about knowing when to disappear. I'd been his personal assistant for 14 months. 14 months of early mornings and late nights. Of learning the particular silence that meant leave the room versus the silence that meant stay, but don't speak. I knew his schedule better than my own. I knew he took his coffee black, no sugar, and that he despised speakerphone, and that he never, not once, raised his voice when he was truly angry. That last part had taken me the longest to understand. Most people think power sounds loud. It doesn't. Not his kind. His kind is the low hum before a storm. The stillness that makes a room hold its breath. I should have known better than to forget that, even for one evening. It was a Thursday. The first Thursday in 4 months that he hadn't needed me past 7. His last instruction before leaving the office had been brief. Clear my Friday morning, I'll be out of the city. And then he was gone, flanked by 2 of his men, the glass doors of the Shin Group's Chicago office swallowing him whole. I'd stood there for a moment, just breathing, feeling the particular lightness that came when he left a room, like pressure releasing from your ears. I went home, changed. And then, because my friend Dana had been asking me for 3 weeks and I was tired of saying no, I agreed to meet her downtown for dinner. She brought someone. His name was Marcus. He was a structural engineer from Wicker Park, Dana's co-worker's friend, the kind of man who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He was funny in an unforced way, and he paid for the wine without making a thing of it, and when he laughed, it reached his eyes. It had been so long since I'd sat across from someone who just seemed normal, easy, unweighted by everything unsaid. We ended up at a bar on West Randolph afterward. Dana disappeared conveniently around 10, claiming an early morning, giving me a look over her shoulder that I pretended not to see. Marcus and I stayed another hour. We talked about nothing important. Cities we'd visited. A documentary about deep-sea fish we'd both seen. Whether Chicago winters were survivable or genuinely designed to break people. I took a cab home at 11:15, smiled the whole ride and thought, this is what normal feels like. I didn't think about Seok-jin once. That was my first mistake. Friday came and went quietly. His absence made the office feel larger than it was. People talked a little more freely, moved a little less carefully. I caught up on correspondence, reorganized his travel files, left early for the first time in months. Saturday, I slept in. Sunday, I grocery shopped like a functioning human being. By Monday morning, I had almost convinced myself that Thursday had simply been a regular night out, that it meant nothing, that there was nothing to mean anything in the first place. Then I walked into the office. The receptionist glanced at me when I came through the doors. Just a glance. A half-second too long, the kind that prickles the back of your neck. I told myself I was imagining it. I rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, badge in hand, already mentally drafting his Monday briefing in my head. Seok-jin was already there. He wasn't supposed to be back until noon. He was standing at the window when I pushed open the door to the executive suite. His back to the room, hands clasped behind him, looking out at the gray sprawl of the city. He was in a dark suit, no tie, and the morning light did something strange to the ink along his neck, made the lines of the tattoos look almost like shadow. He didn't turn around. "Good morning," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. He didn't respond immediately. A beat passed. 2. "How was your weekend?" he asked. His Korean accent was subtle most of the time, something that surfaced in certain vowels, in the particular flatness of certain consonants. Right now it was more pronounced than usual, and I couldn't have explained why that made me feel like the floor had shifted slightly beneath me. "Fine," I said. "Quiet. I've got your Monday briefing ready. There are 3 items that need your attention before. I heard you went out Thursday night." I stopped, not because it was strange that he knew. Nothing about what Seokjin knew or didn't know had surprised me for a long time. What stopped me was the way he said it. Flat. Perfectly, carefully flat. The way still water looks right before you realize how deep it goes. "I had dinner with a friend," I said. He turned then. Slowly, the way he did everything. As though time answered to him, and not the other way around. His eyes found mine across the room and stayed there. And I made myself hold the look. Made myself breathe normally. Made myself remember that I had done absolutely nothing wrong. "A friend," he repeated. "Yes." The word sat between us. He walked toward his desk, not toward me, just toward the desk, and picked up a folder that was already open there, eyes dropping to it for exactly 1 second before lifting back to my face. "Dinner turned into drinks," he said. It wasn't a question. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not guilt. I refused to call it guilt. Something else. Something that felt more like standing at the edge of something I hadn't seen coming. "We stayed for 1 drink after dinner," I said. "It was a Thursday night. You were out of the city. I wasn't on call." "I know," he said. And then he looked back down at the folder and said, without inflection, without heat, "Let's go over the briefing." Just like that. I sat down across from his desk and opened my notes with hands that were, I was annoyed to realize, not entirely steady. He didn't mention it again. We went through the briefing point by point, and he asked sharp, precise questions, and nothing about his voice or his posture gave anything away. But 3 times during that meeting, his eyes drifted to my face in a way that had nothing to do with what I was saying. I noticed all 3 times, and said nothing, and kept my voice level, and wondered what exactly I had walked back into. The week moved the way weeks do when something unspoken is sitting in the middle of a room. Everyone steps around it, nobody names it, and somehow that makes it take up more space, not less. Seokjin was in the office every day. That alone was unusual. He typically split his time between the Chicago office, his private holdings across the city, and whatever happened in the places I wasn't supposed to ask about. But that week, he was there every morning before I arrived, and still there every evening when I left. And I couldn't decide if that was coincidence or something else entirely. He didn't bring up Thursday again. He didn't have to. It was in the way he watched me cross the room when I brought his briefing materials. In the way his eyes stayed on my hands when I set documents on his desk. Small things. The kind of things that, if I'd tried to describe them to anyone, to Dana, for instance, would have sounded like nothing. He looked at you? So what? But there's a difference between being seen and being watched, and I was starting to feel the weight of the second one in a way I couldn't shake loose. Wednesday afternoon, he called me into his office for a conference call with his legal team in New York. Standard procedure. I sat across from him, laptop open, taking notes while the attorneys talked through a property acquisition. 20 minutes in, one of the lawyers, a man named Garrett who always spoke too fast and too loud, made an error in the figures, a significant one. Before I could stop myself, I said, "That number's off." The net projection on the Lakeshore asset was revised down by 8% in the October report. Silence on the call. Seokjin looked at me. Not sharply, not with irritation. Just looked. A long, unhurried look that I felt along my collarbone for some reason I refused to examine. "She's correct," he said into the phone. His tone didn't change. "Pull the October report and call me back in an hour." He ended the call. The office went quiet. I was already looking back down at my laptop, already composing some internal explanation for why I'd spoken out of turn, when he said, "Good catch." 2 words. That was it. but from him, in that room, with that particular quiet behind them. It landed differently than it should have. I nodded and said thank you and left when he dismissed me, and I spent the rest of the afternoon telling myself I was being ridiculous. Thursday came back around. Exactly 1 week after dinner with Dana and Marcus and the bar on West Randolph. I didn't plan to go out. I genuinely didn't. But Dana texted at 6, and Marcus had apparently asked about me. And there was something about the symmetry of it. The same evening, the same freedom, the same reminder that I had a life outside of that office and the gravitational pull of a man who had no right to occupy this much of my thinking that made me say yes. We went to a different bar this time, closer to my apartment in Lincoln Park. Smaller, dimmer, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a good whiskey list. Marcus was already there when I arrived, and he smiled when he saw me, and it was uncomplicated in a way that felt almost medicinal. We were there maybe an hour. I was mid-sentence. Something about the difference between Chicago and New York summers, something light, something easy. When I felt it. I don't know how to explain it except to say that the air in the room changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way anyone else would have noticed. But I had spent 14 months learning to read the particular atmospheric shift that preceded Seokjin's presence, and my body recognized it before my brain did. My voice faltered, just slightly, just a stutter of half a syllable, and I looked toward the door. He was there, not alone. He was never alone. 2 of his men flanked him at a distance, enough distance to look casual, close enough to mean something. He was in a dark coat, the collar turned up slightly against the November air that must have followed him in from outside. His eyes swept the room the way they always did, that habitual, unhurried inventory of every exit and every face. They landed on me. I watched something move across his expression. So fast I would have doubted it if I hadn't been looking directly at him. A tightening. A compression of something that he shut down almost instantly. Replacing it with the smooth, unreadable surface I knew better than almost anything else. Marcus was still talking. I heard his voice like something coming through water. Seokjin didn't leave. He moved to the bar, on the opposite end, far enough to be deniable, close enough to be entirely deliberate. And he ordered something without looking at the menu, and he didn't look at me again. He didn't have to. "Hey," Marcus said. "You okay?" "Sorry." I pulled my eyes back, smiled. "Sorry, I thought I saw someone I knew." Marcus glanced toward the bar, the natural reflex, and then back at me. "Coworker?" "Something like that," I said. I made it another 20 minutes. 20 minutes of conversation I processed maybe 40% of. 20 minutes of keeping my posture easy and my expression open, and my awareness split directly down the middle. Marcus in front of me, Seokjin at the edge of my peripheral vision like a dark star I was trying not to orbit. When I said I was tired and should head home, Marcus walked me out. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and he said he'd like to do this again, and I said maybe, which was honest in a complicated way. And then I watched him walk toward the L stop and turned back toward the bar's entrance to find my rideshare. Seokjin was standing just outside the door, not waiting. He didn't wait. Waiting implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was not something he appeared capable of. He was simply there, coat collar still turned up, hands in his pockets, looking at me with an expression I had no clean word for. The 2 men were behind him, out of earshot. "This is a coincidence," I said. I didn't make it sound like I believed it. "Is it?" he said. Also not a question. The cold air sat between us. A cab passed on the street. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed. "You're following me," I said. Saying it out loud made my heart beat harder, but I kept my voice flat because I had learned from him that flat was its own kind of armor. "I was having a drink," he said. "At the same bar. On the same night." He looked at me for a long moment. The streetlight above us caught the edge of his jaw, the line of ink along his neck, the particular stillness he wore like a second skin. "Who is he?" he asked. And there it was, not hidden anymore, not tucked behind flat tones and careful silences. I felt something shift, something that was partly indignation, and partly, if I was being brutally honest with myself, something else, something warmer and far more dangerous. He's nobody, I said. He's a friend of a friend. You smiled at him, Seokjin said, the whole time. I opened my mouth, closed it. I smile at people, I said. It's something humans do. Nothing in his face moved, but something in his eyes did. Something that flickered and steadied, and left me feeling like the ground was slightly tilted. Go home, Amelia, he said quietly. My name in his mouth always sounded different than it did anywhere else. I'd noticed that before, and worked hard at not noticing it. Right now, it was especially difficult to ignore. You can't tell me who to spend my evenings with, I said. I was proud of how even it came out. I know, he said. Then he stepped back, just slightly, just enough, and tilted his head toward the black car that had materialized at the curb, his driver already waiting. My car will take you home, he said. It's cold. I wanted to refuse. Every sensible part of me lined up behind that impulse, shoulder to shoulder, united. But the wind came off the lake at exactly that moment, cutting through my coat like it had a personal grievance, and I was tired, and his expression had something in it I'd never quite seen before, something careful and almost raw, pressed behind all that control like something trying to get through a locked door. I got in the car. He didn't follow. He stayed on the sidewalk, and the door closed, and the car pulled smoothly into traffic, and I sat in the warm leather interior and stared at my own hands and thought about the way he'd said you smiled at him the whole time. And I could not, no matter how hard I tried, make myself feel nothing about it. I didn't sleep well. That wasn't new. There had been plenty of nights in 14 months where my brain refused to quiet down, running through the next day's schedule or replaying something I'd said in a meeting, looking for the error. But this was different. This wasn't work anxiety. This was something that sat lower, warmer, and considerably more inconvenient. I kept coming back to the same image. Seokjin on that sidewalk, the cold air between us. His voice saying you smiled at him the whole time with that terrifying evenness that somehow made it worse than if he'd been angry. Anger I could have categorized. Anger I could have filed away under boss behaving inappropriately and moved on. This was harder to file. I got up at 5:30, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table in the gray Lincoln Park dark, telling myself a series of sensible things. He was my employer. He was possessive by nature. I had seen that quality applied to business dealings, to properties, to people in his orbit who worked for him. It didn't mean anything specific directed at me. I was an asset to him, a capable one. He didn't want to lose a good assistant, that was all. By the time I'd finished the coffee, I almost believed it. I was at my desk by 8. He arrived at 8:40, which was late for him, and he came in without his usual advance call to let me know he was on his way. He passed my desk without stopping, said good morning without looking at me, and closed his office door behind him. Fine. Good. Normal. Except that 40 minutes later, Min-jun, his head of security, a broad, quiet man who had never once initiated a conversation with me, appeared at my desk and set down a paper coffee cup from the cafe 2 blocks away. The one I preferred. Not the office coffee machine, not the cafe downstairs that was closer. The one 2 blocks away, where they put a little too much oat milk in and always wrote a small star on the cup without being asked. There was a star on the cup. Min-jun was already walking away. Did he? I started. Min-jun didn't turn around. I sat there holding the cup with both hands and stared at the closed office door for probably 15 seconds longer than was warranted, and then I took a sip and opened my email and did not allow myself to think about it. The weekend arrived like a reprieve I wasn't sure I deserved. I called Dana Saturday morning, told her most of it. The bar, Seokjin appearing, the car ride home. Left out the part about how his voice had sounded when he said my name, because some things are not ready to be said out loud yet. Dana was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then, Amelia, baby, you know what that is, right? It's a man with control issues, I said. It's a man who's jealous. He doesn't have the right to be jealous. Okay, Dana said pleasantly, in the tone she used when she thought I was being willfully dense. And yet, he's my boss. He sent someone 2 blocks out of their way to get you the right coffee. That could be about anything. He probably wants something from me work-wise. Amelia. I stopped. When's the last time a man paid that much attention to you? She asked. I didn't answer, because the answer was embarrassing, and we both knew it. After I hung up, I went for a long walk along the lakefront, hands buried in my coat pockets, watching the gray water move. I was not a dramatic person. I was practical and organized, and I prided myself on clear thinking. I had taken this job because it paid well, and it was demanding in ways that suited me. And I had kept it for 14 months by being good at it, and by not complicating it. I was complicating it. Or something was complicating it. And the honest question, the one I kept walking past, the one I had to stop and actually stand in front of, was whether the complication had started this week, or whether it had been building much longer, and I had simply been too careful to look at it directly. I thought about the first time I'd watched him shut down a room full of men twice his age with nothing but silence. The way I'd felt something then. Not fear, exactly, though it had taken me a while to name what it actually was. I thought about the afternoon 3 months ago, when I'd worked 18 straight hours on a contract emergency, and he'd told me, at the end of it, that I was the most capable person on his staff, and the way he'd said it, not like a compliment, like a fact, like something he'd simply noted and saw no reason to withhold. I thought about how I had replayed that sentence approximately 400 times in the weeks following. None of this was new information. I had just been storing it somewhere I didn't look. I walked home and made dinner, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, and made a decision. I was going to be professional, clear-eyed. Whatever was happening, whatever Seokjin was or wasn't feeling, whatever I was or wasn't feeling, I was going to show up Monday morning and do my job, and not make anything larger than it was. Monday arrived and immediately made that decision difficult. He called me into his office at 9. Not unusual. I came in with my tablet, ready for a briefing or a call or a schedule review, and he was standing by the window again, his default position, his thinking place. And he turned when I came in and looked at me the way he occasionally did, like he was calculating something just slightly beyond what the situation called for. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He didn't sit. He stayed standing, which meant I had to look up at him, which I suspected was not accidental. He picked up a folder from his desk and held it out toward me. I took it. Inside were papers relating to an upcoming private event, a dinner hosted by a man named Charles Whitfield, a real estate developer with interests that overlapped with several of Seokjin's legitimate business dealings. The dinner was Friday evening, private, formal, held at Whitfield's home in Kenilworth. "I need you there," Seokjin said. "Not as staff, as my guest." I looked up from the folder. "Your guest?" I repeated. "There will be conversations I need documented, people I need assessed. You're better at reading a room than anyone I have." He said it the same way he said most things, as though it were simply a logistical fact, and not something that made my pulse do something irregular. "You'll need something appropriate to wear. Use the company card." "I have appropriate things to wear," I said, a little more quickly than I intended. Something shifted in his expression. Almost, not quite. A smile, the closest he usually got. "I'm sure you do." I looked back down at the folder, turned a page, steadied myself. "Will your usual security be present?" I asked. Professional, clear-eyed. "Yes." "And my role is observation and documentation?" "Yes." "Okay." I closed the folder and stood. "I'll review the guest list this afternoon." I was almost to the door when he said my name. Just that. Just Amelia. The way he said it that always sounded different. I turned. He was looking at me across the room with that expression I still didn't have a clean word for. The one that had been on the sidewalk outside the bar. The one that had kept me up past 2 a.m. In daylight, in the hard, clear light of his office, it was somehow more visible, not less. Something deliberate in it. Something that had stopped trying quite so hard to be nothing. "The man from the bar," he said. "You're not seeing him again." It wasn't a question. It wasn't exactly an order either. It sat somewhere in between, in that specific register he used when he knew he was overstepping and was doing it anyway, consciously, with full awareness of what he was doing. Every sensible part of me rose up again. I felt the words forming. "You don't get to decide that. That's not your call. I don't belong to you." And they were all true. Every one of them. I looked at him for a long moment. "I'll have the guest list reviewed by 3, I said. And I walked out. And I stood in the hallway outside his closed door for approximately 4 seconds, hand flat against the wall, breathing. And I thought, I am in serious trouble. The dress I chose was burgundy. I told myself it was practical. Dark enough for a formal evening, appropriate for the setting, nothing that would draw unnecessary attention. I told myself that 3 times while standing in front of my mirror Friday evening, and by the 3rd time, I had stopped believing it entirely. I knew why I'd chosen it. I just wasn't ready to say so out loud. The car arrived at 7. Not one of the standard black sedans. A different one. Longer, quieter, with tinted windows that turned the Chicago streetlights into soft amber smears. Min Jun was in the front passenger seat. He nodded once when I got in, which was, from him, essentially a warm greeting. Seokjin was already inside. He was looking at his phone when I got in, but he put it away immediately. A thing I had noticed he always did. A habit of attention that I'd catalogued long ago and tried not to read too much into. He looked at me, not quickly. The kind of look that starts at the top and takes its time, unhurried, like he had every right to it. And then his eyes came back to my face and stayed there. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You look," he started, and then stopped, reconsidered. "Good," he finished. From anyone else, good would have been underwhelming. From Seokjin, who weighed every word before releasing it, who never said anything he didn't mean, who had a vocabulary of restraint so refined it had its own grammar. From him, good landed like something considerably more. "Thank you," I said, and looked out the window, and was grateful for the dim interior of the car. The Whitfield estate in Kenilworth was the kind of place that announces itself from the end of the driveway. Stone and glass, lit from below, surrounded by bare November trees that in the darkness looked like something from a painting. Valets at the entrance, a guest list at the door, and inside, the particular atmosphere of money that doesn't need to announce itself. Quiet, warm, dense with the smell of expensive flowers and old wood. There were perhaps 40 guests, the kind of people who owned things, buildings, companies, politicians if you were reading between the lines correctly. I recognized 2 names from Seokjin's business files and flagged them mentally as I accepted a glass of wine from a passing server. Seokjin moved through the room the way he always moved, slowly, deliberately, speaking to almost no one, and being approached by almost everyone. I stayed close enough to be available, far enough to give him room, and watched. That was the job. Watch, remember, tell him later what I'd seen, what I saw, over the course of an hour and a half. Whitfield himself, 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd learned to perform warmth so well it was almost indistinguishable from the real thing. Spent 11 minutes with Seokjin near the fireplace. I was not close enough to hear the conversation, but I watched Whitfield's hands, which talked too much, and his eyes, which kept sliding sideways toward a man across the room named Garrett Powell, whose name was on my flagged list. Whatever they were discussing, it involved Powell, and Whitfield was nervous about Seokjin knowing that. I made a mental note. 40 minutes in, a woman named Catherine Hale appeared at Seokjin's elbow. I knew who she was. I had put her name in his briefings before. a Chicago socialite with inherited money and a long-standing interest in being adjacent to powerful men. She was beautiful in a practiced way, all blonde hair and a green dress and a laugh she deployed like a tool. She touched Seok-jin's arm when she spoke to him. Something happened in my chest that I did not appreciate. I turned away deliberately and focused on Garrett Powell, who was now speaking to a younger man near the bar. And I concentrated very hard on reading their body language and not on the fact that Catherine Hale was still talking to Seok-jin 14 feet behind me. "You're very focused." The voice came from my left. A man, mid-40s, pleasant face, a glass of bourbon in hand. Thomas Reed, according to the guest list. Architect, connected to 2 of Whitfield's development projects. "Force of habit," I said, and smiled, and let him talk, because standing engaged in conversation was better than standing alone watching my employer be touched on the arm by a woman in a green dress. Reed was harmless and actually somewhat interesting. He had opinions about Chicago's architectural history that were specific enough to be genuine. And I was doing fine. I was managing, until I felt it again. That shift. That atmospheric pressure change. I turned slightly, just enough, and Seok-jin was 6 feet away. He had crossed the room. He was not looking at Reed. He was looking at me, with an expression that was perfectly controlled and absolutely furious in the way that only I, after 14 months, would have been able to identify. The almost invisible tightness at the corners of his eyes, the particular set of his jaw, the way his shoulders had dropped exactly 1 degree, which meant the opposite of relaxation. He came to stand beside me, not between me and Reed. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Beside me, close enough that his arm was a half-inch from mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him through my sleeve. "Reed," he said. His voice was pleasant. Completely pleasant. The pleasantness was its own warning. Reed blinked, recalibrated instantly. I watched it happen, watched him recognize who was standing there, watched the casual ease drain from his posture and get replaced by something more careful. "Mr. Shin, I didn't realize—" "You know each other?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Briefly," Seok-jin said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Reed was already making polite noises about needing to find his wife, and then he was gone, absorbed back into the party, and Seok-jin and I were standing side by side facing a room that had, on some imperceptible frequency, registered his movement and adjusted accordingly. "I was having a conversation," I said quietly. "I know. A professional one." "I know," he said again. Same tone. No acknowledgement that this was the 3rd time in 2 weeks he had appeared beside me while I was talking to someone else. No acknowledgement that there was a pattern, or that the pattern meant anything. I picked up my wine glass and took a sip and stared at the middle distance. "Catherine Hale touched your arm," I said. I don't know why I said it. The words were out before I'd fully decided to release them. Silence beside me. Then, "Did she?" For about 40 seconds. Another silence. Longer. Then very quietly, in a tone that did something to my peripheral nervous system. "Were you watching?" I didn't answer. My face was warm and I was grateful for the dim lighting. He made a sound, not quite a laugh. Something smaller. Something I had never heard from him before, and that I immediately wanted to file somewhere safe and examine later. "Come with me," he said. He walked toward the edge of the room, toward a set of French doors that led to what appeared to be a covered terrace. I followed, because I always did, because that was the job, because— and this was the part I was done pretending wasn't true. There was nowhere else I wanted to be. The terrace was empty, cold, November air coming off the lake in the distance, but covered and heat-lamped and lit with small Edison bulbs that made everything amber and warm. The sound of the party behind the glass doors became a muffled, distant thing. He stood at the railing and looked out at the dark lawn below. I stood beside him, close but not touching, and for a while neither of us said anything. The silence between us had always had texture. That was something I'd noticed early. different qualities depending on the moment. This one was not uncomfortable. It was something else, heavy with things that had been circling for weeks. Whitfield is hiding his connection to Powell, I said eventually, because that was safe, because that was the job. I know, he said. I saw your face from across the room when you figured it out. I looked at him. He was still looking at the lawn. You were watching me, I said. I'm always watching you, he said, simply, as though it were the most obvious thing. The heat lamp above us clicked softly, the distant murmur of voices behind the glass. I felt the full weight of 14 months settle around that sentence, and I thought about every time I'd felt observed without being able to prove it, every coffee from the right cafe, every moment of silence that had felt like something other than silence. Seokjin, I said, his name. Not Mr. Shin, not any of the careful professional distances I'd built. He turned his head then, looked at me, really looked. Not the room-scanning inventory, not the calculating assessment, just looked, the way you look at something you've been looking at for a long time. This is not simple, I said. What you're doing. Whatever this is, it's not simple for me. I know, he said, for the third time. But this time it meant something entirely different. His hand came up, slowly, deliberately, everything he did. And his fingers touched my jaw. Just that. Just the edge of his hand against my jaw. Barely contact. Barely anything. Asking something without asking it. I didn't move away. The night sat around us, cold and amber, and the party continued inside where neither of us existed for a few more minutes, and I stood there with his hand against my face and understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I had been in this exact place, emotionally, inescapably, for considerably longer than 2 weeks. He dropped his hand, stepped back, looked at me with that expression I finally had a word for. Not yet, it said. But I nodded, though he hadn't spoken, because I understood him, because 14 months of learning the language of his silences had led, without my permission, to this, to understanding him better than was safe, better than was wise, better than made any of the sensible things I'd told myself at 5:30 on a Friday morning feel like anything other than theater. We should go back in, he said. Yes, I said. We went back in. And we were professional. And I documented everything I needed to document. And he handled Whitfield and Powell with the quiet precision that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. And twice more that evening, from across the room, I felt him watching. And both times, I let myself watch back. The Monday after the Whitfield dinner, I got to the office first. That had never happened before. In 14 months, he had always been there when I arrived, already behind his desk or standing at his window, already inside whatever calculations occupied his mind before the rest of the city was awake. But that morning, his office was dark when I came through the glass doors, and the 32nd floor had the particular stillness of a room that hasn't been breathed in yet. I made coffee, set up my workstation, opened the files I needed, and I sat with what had happened on that terrace, not running from it this time, not filing it somewhere I wouldn't look, just sitting with it, the way you eventually have to sit with things you've been circling for too long. His hand against my jaw, the way he'd looked at me. 14 months of small accumulated things that had been building a structure I'd pretended not to see. I had decisions to make. Real ones. Not the panicked 5:30 in the morning variety. Actual decisions, made with clear eyes, about what I wanted, and what I was willing to risk, and what I understood about the man at the center of all of it. Because understanding Seokjin, really understanding him, meant holding two things at once. He was powerful in ways that were not entirely clean. I was not naive about what the Shin Group was, about what moved beneath the surface of its legitimate business dealings, about why men like Whitfield were careful around him, and why Min Jun never left his side. I had known that from the beginning, and I had stayed. and I had told myself it was because the job was good and the money was good and that was all. But I had also watched him, in 14 months, be precise and controlled, and occasionally almost kind in ways he clearly hadn't intended to reveal. I had watched him protect people, quietly, without announcement, in ways that only became visible in retrospect. I had watched him carry something heavy and do it without complaint, without asking anyone to notice, and I had noticed anyway. I was not confused about who he was. I was very clear on who he was, and I had made my decision somewhere between the terrace railing and now, and the decision was that I was done pretending I hadn't. He arrived at 8:15. He stopped when he saw me, briefly, just a half-step pause, and then came in normally, set his phone on the desk, shrugged off his coat. He looked at me the way he'd been looking at me for 2 weeks, that barely contained thing. And I looked back and didn't perform neutrality. He noticed immediately. Of course he did. "Close the door," I said. His eyebrows moved, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. I was fluent now. He closed the door. I stood up from my desk and faced him across the room. "I'm not seeing Marcus again," I said. "Not because you told me not to. Because I don't want to. There's a difference, and I need you to understand that difference before anything else." He was very still. "I have one condition," I said. "One." He waited. "You tell me the truth. Not everything. I'm not asking for everything. I know what you are, and I know there are things that aren't mine to know. But when something touches me, when something affects what we are to each other, you tell me the truth. No silences that aren't silences. No distance you use as a wall." I paused. "I've spent 14 months learning your language. I'm asking you to speak it with me." The room was absolutely quiet. Seokjin looked at me for a long time, long enough that a less certain version of myself might have started backtracking, filling the silence with apologies or qualifications. But I had decided, and I was steady in it, and I let the silence be what it was. Then he crossed the room. Not quickly. Nothing he did was quick, but with a directness that left no ambiguity. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I had to look up slightly, and he looked at my face with that expression that I now had a full and accurate word for: want. Patient, restrained, carefully managed want that had been sitting behind 14 months of professionalism and had finally stopped pretending to be something else. "Yes," he said. One word, but from him it was a contract. His hand came up to my face the way it had on the terrace. That same deliberate care, like I was something he'd been waiting to touch without breaking. This time, I leaned into it slightly, just slightly, and something moved through his expression that I had never seen there before. Something that looked, stripped of all the control and the careful management, remarkably like relief. He pressed his forehead to mine. We stood like that for a moment, just breathing the same air. The cold morning light coming through the office windows, the city beginning its noise 32 floors below. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. The honesty in it was startling. Not because I'd thought him dishonest, but because he guarded that register of himself so completely. It was the most unguarded thing I had ever heard him say. "Neither do I said. "We'll figure it out." We did not figure it out overnight. I want to be honest about that, because the truth of it mattered more than any clean version I could have constructed. The weeks that followed were not seamless. There were days when the lines blurred in ways that made my head hurt, when I couldn't tell where the job ended and something else began, when his protectiveness tipped past warmth into a control I had to push back against, when I had to remind him, sometimes firmly, that my autonomy was not negotiable, that I was not one of the things he managed. He learned, not easily. Nothing about him was easy, but genuinely. He learned that I didn't need protecting from ordinary life, from ordinary people, from conversations with architects at dinner parties. He learned that my competence was not a threat to whatever he felt for me, but part of why he felt it. He learned, slowly, to trust that I wasn't going anywhere without being held in place. And I learned him in return. The things beneath the control, the weight he carried that came from decisions made long before I arrived, the loyalty he extended to the people in his circle with a fierce quietness that never asked for recognition, the way he slept lightly, always, the way he sat with his back to the wall in every restaurant we ever went to, the way he said my name when we were alone, and it sounded completely different from every other context, like it meant something specific in a language only he spoke. I stopped being his assistant in February. It wasn't dramatic. We talked about it. Actually talked, which was itself a measure of how far we'd come, and agreed it was the right boundary to draw. I took a position with a different firm, one with no connection to the Shin Group, and the morning I cleared my desk on the 32nd floor, I stood in his office one last time and looked at the window where he was always standing when I arrived. He was standing there now, looking at me. "You're going to need someone who makes coffee correctly," I said. "I'll manage," he said. "You won't. You'll terrorize them for 6 months and then they'll quit." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The almost smile, my favorite version of his face. "Probably," he said. I picked up my bag. He crossed the room and stopped in front of me and put his hand against my jaw one more time, the gesture that had started everything, that I would always associate with the cold terrace and the amber lights and the moment I stopped pretending. He looked at me, steady and direct. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," I said. I walked out of that office and down 32 floors and out onto Michigan Avenue, where Chicago was loud and cold and entirely indifferent to the fact that my life had quietly, irrevocably rearranged itself. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. There were things I didn't know. There would always be things I didn't know. Rooms in his life I didn't enter. Weight he carried that I could see but not lift for him. I had made my peace with that. What I knew, what I was certain of, with the same clear-eyed certainty I'd brought to that Monday morning, was what he was to me, and what I was to him, and that we had both stopped being afraid of that truth at roughly the same moment, on a cold terrace in Kenilworth, with our foreheads together and the party going on without us behind the glass. I put my hands in my pockets and started walking. For the first time in 14 months, I was not thinking about tomorrow's schedule, or the right temperature for his coffee, or the particular silence that meant leave the room. I was thinking about tonight, and about all the ordinary evenings lined up after it, and about the way he'd said my name that morning, like it meant something specific, in a language we'd built together, word by careful word, out of 14 months of everything unsaid. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.